Hey guys, it's Paul Hastings here, the host of Compelled, and this is just a special behind-the-scenes update on the show and where we're at. This is not exactly scripted. I've got a few notes of things I want to talk about, but basically this is just kind of a stream of consciousness telling you about what's going on with the show. I thought I would just do this. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll make it an annual tradition. Maybe you can tell me if you like this or not, but let me just kind of tell you what we did last year and then what we're doing this year. So last year, 2024, we released 20 brand new stories. And if you've already listened to those stories, awesome. If you haven't listened to those stories, let me just tell you, here's the shows that we released last year, okay? So we started out with a story about Hayden Jernigan. He was this kid who grew up in a home marked by chaos, and he wasn't sure who loved him, who wanted him, all that kind of thing. And he pursued everything that he thought would bring him happiness until one day he had this crazy encounter with the real God. Then the next episode we dropped was Frank and Annette Loria. Frank was this self-righteous good guy who thought he could earn God's favor by following the rules. Annette, on the other hand, didn't even know if there were rules in the first place that God even cared about, and instead she just indulged in this crazy hedonistic lifestyle. But really, both of them had defined God to be whoever they thought he was. They were both the internal idols of their own selves, and eventually they would find out that God was entirely different. Then the next episode we dropped was James Omandi, and his father was a leper, his mom was a cripple, misery, destitution, starvation, all of those things were a fact of life for this poor kid in Kenya, and then God intervened in his life. We followed that with a story from Jerry Dugan. Jerry's life was a clash between spiritual curiosity, ambivalence, intellectual skepticism, but eventually he faced the prospect of dying on a battlefield in Iraq, and as you know, they say that there are no atheists in foxholes, and that was true for him as well. The next story we released was with Courtney Bruchetta. Courtney lived in this trap of addiction and secrecy. She wrestled daily with pornography and the guilt of living a double life. She was a leader at her church, in her the girls group, in her youth group, and yet at the same time she's living this other double life. And no matter where she turned, she couldn't find a way out, and only Jesus could ultimately set her free. Then we had another story from Troy Gause, a drug dealer who thought that he was invincible until he was shot, partially paralyzed, and placed in a one-man suicide cell where he thought he was going to go insane. But then out of nowhere, he heard a still, small voice. After that, we heard from Anna Chatelaine. Anna had been seeking spiritual answers for about 20, 30 years, something like that. And after finally finding those answers in the Bible and joyfully sharing them with her husband, Anna realized that her husband didn't want anything to do with it. He was an unbeliever. And if that was the case, how would Jesus want her to respond being married to an unbeliever? And then the next story we had was with Lee Strobel. Lee was a committed atheist and Pulitzer-nominated investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. You've probably heard of his book called The Case for Christ. Well, when his wife became a Christian, Lee was disgusted and set out to prove her beliefs about Jesus to be untrue. And that's how he eventually ended up writing the book, The Case for Christ. Along the way, he found way more than he bargained for. And then finally, the final episode of that season. So everything I'm describing so far, I think that was all from season 7. The final episode of season 7 was a two-parter with Jeff Parker. Jeff was the vice president of this thriving Christian media company. He secretly harbored a gambling addiction. He knew that he was supposed to submit his life to Christ, but the chains of sin ran far, far deeper than anyone else knew. He was stealing from the very company that he was supposed to steward this crazy double life. And just an amazing story of how God redeemed him. And that was everything from season 7, all right? So then we took a 1-month break. Maybe it was a 6-week break. And then we came back with season 8. We started that in August. And so season 8, we had Alex Sinjamana. As a child, Alex witnessed the unimaginable, unspeakable horrors of the Rwandan genocide. But after being exposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, Alex was challenged to do the unthinkable, which was to forgive the unforgivable. Then we heard from Kim Bigler. She was just going about another day at home when her teenage son Phoenix collapsed in an alleyway. His heart stopped beating and he died. But as Kim began to pray fervently, asking God to intervene, the God of heaven heard her cry and met her need. After that, we heard a story from Dean Clark. And at birth, Dean was abandoned by his mom. By 13, he began dealing drugs and soon after moved into a party house in Hollywood Hills with the bad boys of rock and roll. Guns N' Roses. Yes, he literally lived in the same home with Guns N' Roses. And what the crazy part about his story is that the same year that Guns N' Roses began to chart #1 in the nation, Dean met the true #1 of his life. After Dean's story, we heard from Wendy Zeringer. Wendy grew up in a broken home and was always searching for the truth, but as she grew older, she fell into rebellion and numbed her pain with drugs and alcohol, and in desperation, she decided to get sober and began reading the Bible, and what she would eventually discover would change her life. Then we heard from Brian Lynn, who was a successful pharmacy manager when his wife left him. After struggling with self-pity and anger, Brian realized that he was now free to wholeheartedly pursue kingdom work around the globe. And today he's now a self-funded missionary planting fruit trees and agricultural projects for villages all across Africa to meet their physical needs, all while sharing the gospel to meet their spiritual needs. Then after Brian, we had a crazy story from Tom Terrence. Back in the 1960s, Tom was a young man on a mission to save America from communism, Marxism, and desegregation, and he felt that the best way to do that was by joining the Ku Klux Klan, engaging in drive-by shootings, and possibly even dying for his cause. Yet God had a far greater plan for this would-be revolutionary. After Tom, we hear from Jessica Carpenter. Jessica experienced the weight of family challenges from an early age, and with limited outlets for her emotions, she started down a path of self-harm and thoughts about suicide. But God saw Jessica in the midst of her struggles and was eager to meet her in her time of need. Then we heard from Peter Davidson. Peter was exposed to cultural Christianity while growing up. He was born just after World War II. Actually, I think he was born in the middle of World War II, actually, so he's an older guy. And so he was exposed to this sort of cultural Christianity that was in America at the time, but it really never meant much to him. He had lost his parents as a child, and his prospects for the future appeared bleak until God came looking for him and eventually would reveal to Peter who his true father was. Then we heard from Terry Roboski. Terry grew up caught between Catholicism and cultural occultic practices, but after the enemy tried everything to destroy her, God allowed Terry's life to become a story of healing and redemption, touching countless lives in ways that she never knew possible. And then finally, the season finale of Season 8. So this was the final episode that we just published about 2 months ago. That episode is with Emil Zwane. He was a rising gang member with a burgeoning future as a drug dealer and a rap star. But then one day he was invited to an event that would change the course of his life. Wow. Okay, that was a lot of stories that we just went through. That's 20 stories that we released last year. And if you felt like you were drinking from a fire hydrant just now, well, that's what it felt like as we were editing all those stories. They were just incredible. I mean, I remember just recording each of those stories and thinking to myself, like, wow, this is incredible, amazing. God, is that work? And then you get to listen to it later on when you're editing it. And, I end up listening to each story probably like 4 or 5 times. And man, that is just wild. And just to see each time, each different way that God works, he's so creative in how he works in people's lives too. It's not like this cookie cutter approach. And these are just the stories that we're just finding, right? There's so many more that we don't have time to include on the show. So anyways, it's just been a blessing for me to work on these. So that's what we did last year on the podcast side of things. We got a couple emails from some listeners. I just want to read these quotes to you. And this is just so encouraging, at least for me to know that folks are listening to these stories, and these stories really do have the ability to change and shape people's lives as they understand who God is. Here's this first email we got. It says, I had always been a closed book because I was afraid of people finding out the truth of the sexual sin I was involved in. I listened to episode 80 and 81, My Double Life by Jeff Parker, one morning at work and was brought to tears for the first time in a very long time. I knew that I needed to repent and turn from my sins and back to the Lord. It brought me to my knees, and I confessed my 11 years of hidden sexual sin for the very first time. I have formed a group around me for accountability and have been in the Word so much deeper than ever before. I have never confessed. I have only ever been caught in the act. But the Lord has absolutely transformed my life, where everything is now an open book. It feels like 1,000 pounds have been lifted off my mind. Praise the Lord. God used his story to convict me and stir my heart towards repentance. Praise the Lord. I'm finally free. And that's just a message from Jalen T. We got another message from Ruthie in Raleigh, North Carolina. She wrote, I originally heard about Compelled when I was listening to another podcast. They mentioned Compelled, and I thought I would check it out. I have often felt my life is incredibly boring, and my story to redemption is not worth mentioning. However, since listening to Compelled, I have been encouraged tremendously. I have been affirmed that God sees me and most likely does not find me boring. I have learned the power of prayer is far more powerful than I have realized, and the God I serve is far more magnificent than I could imagine. Thank you so much for bringing hope into a dark world through the stories of our brothers and sisters in Christ. It's inspiring and helps me know that I am not alone. I have cried, I have laughed, and I have danced at the testimonies I have heard. And that's just a couple of messages that we've received throughout the year. And we get a lot of messages all the time. This is just a couple I wanted to share with you. If you have felt encouraged by these stories, then I'd encourage you, hey, send these to us because it at least encourages my soul. And it's just exciting to share with the rest of our team, with my wife as well. So that means a lot to us. Okay, other things that we did last year, besides those 20 testimonies released, which was basically the majority of everything that we did, lots of other moving pieces and parts and things that we've been working on all year long. One of those finally came to fruition last year, which it was a project that we'd been working on for probably at least 2 years pretty aggressively, which was our podcast network, Proclaim. And so we launched this podcast network back in August, and it's essentially a collection of other podcasts similar to Compelled that are story-driven. They use immersive storytelling techniques, and they're all about praising the Lord for who He is. The tagline to the network is thoughtfully crafted, faithfully told stories that proclaim His name, and that's really what it's all about. There are 4 shows in the network currently. The first one, obviously, is Compelled. The next one is Exempla, which is hosted by my friend Nathaniel Brown. And every episode, he brings out a tale, either from history or from his own personal life, or maybe it's an Aesop's fable, or maybe it's a fable that he wrote up himself. But he'll tell this short little story, and then he'll have a biblical application to it. He'll add some music to it and some sound effects. It just sounds really fun. It's a really great listen to. It's great for your whole family. I've enjoyed listening to them, and actually, he just released an episode today, actually, as I'm recording this episode right now, this behind-the-scenes, he just released an episode this morning. So again, great content. Another show in our network is God Out Loud, hosted by my friend Rob Vischer. And Rob lives out in Tennessee, close to the Nashville area, and his show is about stories of people saying that they heard God speak to them out loud. Now, it might also be metaphorically out loud, but it's always about a distinctive story of someone saying, hey, I think I just had this, essentially a miraculous message from God. I think God just told me to do something. And, that might sound a little bit odd to you, but if you listen to some of these stories, you'll walk away like, yeah, I think that actually happened. I literally think God moved in a miraculous way and told someone to take some particular action. And it's a really cool show. I've really enjoyed listening to it. And fun note actually is, so Rob had launched that show, I think 3 years ago. He did 1 season, and then his show has been dormant for the last 3 years. After partnering together in the Proclaim Network, we were able to help launch his 2nd season. And I believe his show shot up, I think, to like number 26 or 19 or something like that in the Apple Christianity podcast charts. And so, I mean, that's really high up there, actually. And so we were able to just help him get that relaunched again. And currently he's out fundraising for his next season of God Out Loud. It's a great show. You should definitely listen to that. And then finally, the last show in our network is Story Partners. And Story Partners, that's hosted by Walt and Annie Manus. They live here in Austin, where I live as well. In fact, I just saw them face-to-face like a week ago. And they're this wonderful couple. They're making a show very similar to Compelled, actually, where there are these amazing God stories from around the world. Actually, I think they just went to Germany, I think, last year, and collected a whole bunch of new episodes that are about to come out in their next season. I think their next season is dropping in just a few weeks from now, actually. So anyway, Story Partners, another great show. So those are the 4 shows that are part of Proclaim. If you want to listen to any of these shows, just look up proclaim.fm, and you'll find links to all 4 of these shows. Again, that's proclaim.fm. Back on the Compelled side of things, we had, we we're publishing episodes for an entire year. I believe that means I just finished my second year of working on the show full time. I think we had about 800,000 downloads. I think it was like 834,000 downloads. So we're very close to 1 million. I thought we were going to do 1 million downloads this year, but we did not. Apple actually changed some of their podcast algorithm stats, and so we didn't quite hit 1 million, but I think we're going to do that this coming year, which I guess would actually be this year right now, 2025. And then the other Proclaim shows, actually, when we helped them launch their shows on Proclaim, I think collectively the three other shows, I think they did about 60,000 downloads, which was, I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think that was essentially 10x what they had done in years prior. So it was just really cool to be able to kind of help amplify their message, identifying them, and just showcasing, hey, this is what God is doing around the world. Let's help spread their message as well. And then finally, there was one other very, very top secret project that my wife and I worked on related to Compelled. And it is very, very top secret. I can't really tell you much more about it. If you were on our email list, though, then you would have seen a very quick message about that. We just wrapped up the first major stage of that back on December 26th or 27th, I think. So yeah, the very, very top secret project. You will learn more about it, especially as we get closer to the summer. But for now, the word is mum. All right, what does 2025 look like for Compelled? Because obviously this is the behind-the-scenes update. We've talked about what happened in the past, now what's happening in the future. So, exciting news. We just finished recording our next batch of episodes. We recorded 20 interviews total. That was back on January 13th through 18th. My friend Gabriel, who films a lot of these interviews for me, he and I were holed up at a church in Austin, and we recorded 20 interviews. We had people flying in from all across the country. One guy actually flew in from Hawaii to share his testimony. Now, he actually lives in Nebraska, but he was flying from Hawaii back home, and then he made a stop in Austin just to share his testimony. Very cool. I was very grateful for Wayne. Anyways, 20 interviews. Just a handful I'll tell you about. We had a story with a guy. Well, man, where do I even start? Okay, we had one guy who was the editor for World Magazine for 30 years, but he actually started out his career as a communist. And even went to Russia in order to essentially become a traitor against the United States back during the Cold War. Crazy story. The Lord drastically changed his life. We had another guy who lived in Bhutan, which is like close to Nepal, and he became a Christian and then was persecuted and locked up because he was a Christian. He was also tortured as a Christian as well, tortured for Christ. We had another story with a couple ladies who belonged to cults, actually. And then we had another lady who was the victim of a drunk driving accident, and her husband was killed in that incident. We just had so many excellent stories that we cannot wait to bring to you. Another one. A gentleman who lived as a transgender woman for 30 years until he gave his life to Christ. So these are just a handful of the stories that we recorded, 20 in total. You will be hearing all of them come out this year and next year as well, because we've got plenty that we've recorded. Other things that are going on. We are launching our radio program that will be on American Family Radio. That's approximately, I think it's 170 stations spread across 34 states, estimated to be maybe 500,000 people listening in. That's launching next Sunday, February 2nd. So by the time you're listening to this, that's like 6 days from now. The team and I are working very hard and heavy. Please keep us in your prayers if you could. There's just a lot to get done, and we're still moving forward very rapidly. If you want to tune in, you can check for station listings near you. It's at afr.net, and the broadcast is from 2 to 3 p.m. Now, if you listen to our podcast, that's totally fine. It's the exact same content as our podcast. However, the radio broadcast, you'll typically hear brand new Compelled episodes, I think 2 days earlier than normal. You'll hear them on the radio. So, you can normally listen to Compelled, but if you really want to listen to it, you can tune on the radio and hear the episode 2 days earlier than normal. Although I should mention, if you become a monthly partner of Compelled, you actually get to listen to brand new episodes a week early because we email those out. Other things, we are launching the next season of Compelled on February 3rd. So that's the day after the show launches on AFR, American Family Radio. But we're launching 10 new episodes for season 9. That'll be February 3rd. It'll run right up until about the middle of June. So we release episodes every 2 weeks. We will then take a break during the summer for about 6 weeks, and then we'll launch season 10 at the end of July, and that'll run for another 10 episodes right up until, I think, before Thanksgiving. Other things that we're working on this year, we are still growing the Proclaim Podast Network. Like I mentioned, those other shows, man, they've got lots of great content that they're churning out. Story Partners is launching their next season, I believe, in just a few weeks. God Out Loud is currently fundraising for season 3. If you want to help with that, it's godoutloud.com. And then Exempla is currently publishing. I already mentioned they just put out an episode this morning, actually. So if you have not listened to Exempla, you need to try them out. It's such a fun show. Episodes are about 10 to 15 minutes long. Even if you listen to other podcasts in your morning routine, you can definitely fit in Exempla. Great show. Highly recommend it. I think the website is exemplapodcast.com, I think. But I'm not entirely certain about that, so probably just go to proclaim.fm and click on the link there, Exempla. Last thing I guess I should mention is fundraising. So a couple months ago, we put out a notification saying, like, hey, we are raising funds to create episodes in 2025. We're trying to raise $60,000. And as of today, when I'm recording this episode right now, and I am recording this on Saturday, January 25th, you're probably listening to it on Monday, January 27th. But as of right now, as of when I'm recording this, we've raised just under $45,000, which is right around 75% of our goal, which is awesome. We are so grateful for everyone who's contributed towards that, and that means the world to us. And frankly, that's the only reason we're able to stay on the air. So thanks for helping out with that. We are still trying to raise the other $15,000, and if that's something that you'd be interested in helping with, you know where to do it. You just go to compelledpodcast.com/donate, and we are grateful for your contributions there. Let me give you 3 ways that you can be involved with our podcast, and then we're going to wrap this out. Okay, 3 ways. The first one is, if you could, please pray that God would bring us the right sponsors for the podcast, and especially for the radio portion. We do have some donations that have allowed us to launch on radio, but we actually do need to secure radio sponsors for us to stay on the radio. So again, we're trying to hold this with an open hand, but if you feel led, please pray that God would connect us with the right nonprofit organization, or couple nonprofit organizations that would like to advertise on the radio. And of course, if you know a great nonprofit and you'd like to connect me with them, you can email me. My email address is very easy to remember. It's just paul@compelledpodcast.com. All right, the second way that you can engage with our podcast is by joining our Compelled Insider email list. And that's where we just post our behind-the-scenes news. That's where we also posted about our top secret project that we're releasing this summer. If you were on the list earlier, good for you, because you got to see what this top secret project is about. But if you missed out, well, hey, I might post about it again later. But that's on our email list. We try to sparingly use the email list. I think last year, I sent out about 10 emails total all year long. So we're not trying to spam you. It's just a fun way to engage with us. If you want to know when we travel to places to record episodes, or if we're going to do a meetup randomly in some city. Actually, I think I'm going to be in Chicago and Columbus this year, actually, come to think of it. I think that'll be sometime in May. Anyways, if you want to do a meetup with me, I might send out an email to the email list saying, like, hey, if you live somewhere nearby, meet up along the way, that kind of thing. And finally, the third way that you can engage with the podcast is we are actually looking for 5 to 10 minute short testimonies that we could potentially play on the radio. And the reason for that is we are recycling some of our older episodes, but some of those older episodes aren't quite long enough to fill an entire radio time spot. And so we're looking for some other testimonies to add on as well. And so that said, if you've got a short story, that one that's like, oh, it's an amazing story, but it's not an hour long. It's not going to fill up the full length of a regular compelled testimony. But hey, it's an awesome story of what God did. If you can tell that story in 5 to 10 minutes, we might play it on the air. If you'd like to do that, just email me and I'll send you the instructions, because I do have some specific instructions on how I'd like you to record that, like how to set up your room for the audio and stuff like that. But just email me. It's paul@compelledpodcast.com. as the subject line, you can just write, testimony, and I'll know what you're talking about. So if you'd like to send me your testimony, email me first, and I will give you instructions on how to record that testimony on your phone. And with that, I think that's pretty much everything. Again, I'm just so grateful to just get to do this as a full-time job. I cannot believe that every morning when I wake up, I get to think about God's work in people's lives around the world. And it's just such an exciting thing to do. It's so rewarding. And I'm also just so excited to hear from people like you who have been touched by these stories. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part and being part of the Compelled family. It is our prayer that God moves in your heart as you continue to listen to these stories and that you take action in your life. That these aren't just stories that you think about and like, oh, that's nice, and and then just go about your life. But instead that you would dwell on these stories and the truths about who God is, and that the next time you face a trial or temptation, you would remember, whoa, God is so much bigger than any problem I'm going through right now. If God can help them, He can help me too. All right, guys. Well, that is it. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with the season premiere of Season 9 of Compelled. We'll see you then.